acquisitions so that we can round out our collection and people can have a fuller tour. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a completely selfish advertisement. The Friends of the Physick Estate is an affinity group of the Mid-Atlantic Center for the Arts and Humanities. If you are a MAC member already, you can choose to be a friend of the Physick Estate at no extra cost, and that will get you invited to the special events that we do, like the trip that we just had to the Newark Museum and the trip that we're planning next year to the Museum of the American Revolution. It also helps us with our mission of providing funds for the restoration and collections of the Physick Estate. And if you're not a MAC member, you can join as a friend of the Physick Estate and get all MAC benefits as well as the access to Friends of the Physick Estate events. So before you leave today, please pick up one of these and join us. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Bill Sprouse. Bill was born in Atlantic City and raised in Egg Harbor Township. He didn't venture much into the Pines when he was growing up, but when he was 10 years old and visiting his grandmother, Helen Leeds, she told him plainly that he was related to the Jersey Devil. And I guess that's where this story begins. I'm just going to turn everything over to Bill.
Thank you very much. Has anyone ever seen the Jersey Devil? You've seen it. Okay. You've seen it. Okay. I should tell you right away that that was the least interesting question that I wanted to answer. I thought there was lots of fascinating stuff about the Jersey Devil, but whether or not it was actually out there was not really not that important to me. So I'm a reporter by trade, and I wrote this book. I don't do a lot of public speaking, so if I have a panic attack up here and pass out, I apologize in advance. But you've already eaten, so. Anyway, this is my book. It's called The Domestic Life of the Jersey Devil, or Bebop's Miscellany. And as Mary said, Bebop was my grandmother. And when I was a little kid, she told me, this is my grandmother, her real name was Mildred Helen Leeds. She didn't like the name Mildred. She'd be mortified if she heard me saying it right now. But everyone called her Bebop. When I was a little kid, that's me when I had better hair, she told me that I was related to this guy on the Jersey Devil, which is this winged monster with the head of a horse and the bat wings and the goat. You can't see his feet, but it looks like he's wearing Crocs in this picture. This is a famous photograph of our ridiculous cryptid that we have here in New Jersey. So my grandmother was a Leeds from Leeds Point. I don't know if that means anything to you guys, but one of the versions of the Jersey Devil story. There's lots of different birthplaces. There's lots of different. It's a piece of living folklore, so there's many different versions. But one of them is that it started in Leeds Point. That's my grandmother on the bike, and that's her sister, Aunt Dottie. And so that was my great aunt and my grandmother. And they grew up in Leeds Point. Whenever it snowed, they lived in this house, which is still there. It's not the Jersey Devil house, by the way. But they lived in this house, and whenever it snowed, this guy, which is my grandmother's grandfather, would make tracks around the house, and he would tell the kids that they'd been put there by their distant relative, the Leeds Devil, which turned into the Jersey Devil later. So it was this sort of tongue-in-cheek joke among the Leeds family. I went through the phone book. These are phone books. They're organized by last name, so you can call people with the last name Leeds. And I would say, I'm a reporter. I'm doing a story about a famous piece of New Jersey folklore. And they would say, oh, yeah, you have the right guy. You want to talk about the Jersey Devil, right? That's our distant relative. So lots of Leedses, not just in New Jersey, but elsewhere around the country, have this as part of the kind of family tradition. I remember talking to one lady in Newark, and she said, my husband was distantly related to the Jersey Devil. And I said, where was your husband from in New Jersey? And she said, he was born in Oakland and raised in Houston or something. But he had family going back to New Jersey, and they were related to the Jersey Devil. This is an illustration. This is actually not the Jersey Devil. This is the Jabberwocky from the original Through the Looking Glass. But it was reprinted in a newspaper in New Jersey in 1909. as sort of a joke, I think, by the editor, who wanted to see if he could sort of sneak this by. And in the headline it said, "The Jabberwocky attacks New Jersey." But one of the versions, as we said, is that the Jersey Devil, or what used to be the Leeds Devil, was the 13th child of a woman named Mother Leeds, who's a Quaker, and it was born either in Leeds Point or Burlington in 1735. On a dark and stormy night. So the question was, like, where did this story come from? It wasn't possible to kind of like figure out where in the Leeds family tree we might have got this idea that there was a Leeds Devil or a Jersey Devil. And it turns out that there was a man named Daniel Leeds, who was one of our more notorious ancestors. And my grandmother was, I can't remember how many generations at this point, I think it was 11 generations, directly descended from Daniel, who lived in the 17th century. He was born around 1650 and he died in 1720. And he was involved in a number of important controversies in what used to be the colony of West Jersey, which is now what we think of as South Jersey. And during one of those fights that he had with the Quakers, someone named Caleb Pusey wrote a pamphlet about him, and it looked like this. And the title was "Satan's Harbinger Encountered," which is supposed to be an answer to Daniel Leeds and his pamphlet, which was called "News of a Trumpet Sounding in the Wilderness." So you can see, if you're trying to figure out where in the Leeds family this connection to monsters might have originated, a pamphlet like this would sort of jump out at you a little bit. So Daniel was involved in I'm not going to get into the kind of historical minutiae, I guess, of this, but Daniel was involved in a couple of important controversies, one of which real historians, who are not me, care about, was called the Keithian controversy, which was this schism between the Quakers. It sort of originated in Philadelphia. And very good historians like John Butler, who's at Yale, and Gary Nash have written papers on this. But this is one of the original documents that I kind of looked at, which is written by this guy named Samuel Jennings, who was sort of on the other side of this fight. And he gave his account of what caused the Keithian controversy. And Daniel was sort of in the middle of it. And his pamphlet that I mentioned a second ago, News of a Trumpet, was sort of his expression of why he joined the Keithians, and why he left the Quakers. The Keithian controversy culminated in this libel trial, which was fun. One of the earliest libel trials in the United States. It was around this time in the 1690s that Daniel, who'd been out here in this part of West Jersey near Philadelphia, started pioneering down here in Leeds Point. He was a surveyor, and he did surveys of Leeds Point. And he may have moved down there, and at least one of his children moved down there, and that's where my grandmother ended up. And in Leeds Point, that's where kids go to this day. When I was in high school, one of my friends got his license, and so we all got in the car and drove around in circles because we didn't have anything else to do. But and we ended up out in Leeds Point, and this is very common. We ended up out in Leeds Point in the middle of the night, and somebody said, "Back there in the woods, that's where the Jersey Devil was born." And there are different spots back in Leeds Point. There's like ruins here and there that kids drive around and say, "That's where the real Jersey Devil was born." And if you're me during that car, you say, "Oh, I'm distantly related to the Jersey Devil." And when that happened, there was another kid in the car who was like, "I'm distantly related to the Jersey Devil too." So we had a nice moment. Turned out he was like a conniver whose family went back way back in the South Jersey business. So my grandmother said that a woman named Deborah Smith, who was married into the Leeds family, she married Japhet Leeds, was the real Mother Leeds. And you can learn a little bit about Deborah. She was a real person. She was a Quaker. She lived in Leeds Point. Her and Japhet had the Quaker meeting there in the 1720s at least. And she had 12 children that we know of. She might have had. My grandmother didn't really think that Deborah had given birth to a 13th child, but she did think that something must have happened to cause the neighbors maybe to tell this story. Deborah would have been about 50 years old in 1735, so she would have been old enough to should have been, it would have been an old pregnancy, but she wouldn't have been so old that it would have been impossible. So she sort of fits this idea that Mother Leeds, who was supposed to be old and poor and had this huge family and didn't want to have any more children, may have said something impolite or, you know, not a great idea to say, may this be a devil, and then the thing kind of flew off. Deborah is the daughter-in-law of Daniel Leeds. Daniel had been a Quaker. This is why I'm not a good public speaker. Daniel had been a Quaker. He had this big fight, falling out with the Quakers, and sort of left and joined the Church of England, or the Anglican Church in the U.S. And then his eldest son, Japhet, went back to the Quakers. And Japhet was married to Deborah. So that might have been a little awkward, to be one of the more prominent anti-Quakers in West Jersey and have a son who's a Quaker. Daniel, apart from writing nasty things about the Quakers, was also politically kind of active, and he worked for a guy named Cornbury, who became the governor of the combined colonies of East and West Jersey around 1702. West Jersey was the Quaker half of New Jersey. This is where the Quakers first sort of set up this utopian kind of colony. It was taken over by the Crown, which you can see that would upset you if you were a South Jersey Quaker. Cornbury did a number of things. This thing called the blind tax was basically a way of shaking down people. He also passed the Militia Act. The Quakers were pacifists, so they didn't want to sign up for the militia. And they basically had to pay a fine to avoid doing that. And there were a few other things that Cornbury did. He's been remembered notoriously as the least, one of the more corrupt governors in the history of the British Empire. He was also supposed to be a transvestite. He supposedly dressed as the Queen. And this painting was supposed to be Cornbury dressed up as the Queen. It turns out that that's bullshit, not to... But it was a rumor that existed at the time. And this painting, I went to see it in the New York Historical Society. It was a very popular thing. People would go have a look at the governor. He was the governor of New York and New Jersey. And they used to sell Cornbury paintings on the sides of coffee cups, you know. And people in the Greenwich Village holiday parade would dress this because it was, you know, kind of cool to have a governor who was dressed as the Queen. Around the time that this is happening, Daniel is writing more nasty things about the Quakers. This is a pamphlet that seems a little salty. News of a strumpet. Everyone knows what a strumpet is, right? Not a nice word. News of a strumpet cohabiting in the wilderness, or a brief abstract of the spiritual and carnal whoredoms and adulteries of the Quakers in America. So this was something that Daniel wrote about the Quakers. And if you can see, this is basically a response to their book, to the Quaker book. You probably can't see it, but it says it's a response to Satan's Harbinger. So Daniel wrote News of a Trumpet. The Quakers wrote Satan's Harbinger encountered. And then Daniel fired back with News of a Strumpet cohabiting in the woods. So it was this pamphlet war. Lots of nasty name calling. Daniel was surveyor, and he intervened. There was an assembly election where 3 West Jersey Quakers had enough votes. They won seats, and it would have allowed the West Jersey Quaker, sort of a political alliance, to to have power in the assembly. Daniel blocked their election. He said they didn't own enough land to qualify. So during that time, Cornbury and his kind of clique was able to push through some legislation that was very offensive to the West Jersey Quakers. This painting is no longer identified as Cornbury. The New York Historical Society took their little plaque that used to, I think it might say it used to be called Cornbury. But this whole idea that this was Cornbury kind of came about after the fact. And a wonderful historian named Patricia Bonami wrote kind of what do they call it? She wrote a revision, basically, of the Cornbury story a few years ago. Daniel was an almanac maker. So I have no doubt that this is probably how most people in West Jersey encountered Daniel Leeds and the Leeds kind of name. This is Daniel's almanac from 1687, and you can see it's basically a calendar. This is one of the earliest almanacs in North America, and one of the more successful ones, I think. I had the wrong idea of what a 17th century almanac was. I thought that they were kind of like today's almanac, something that people, maybe pick up at Cracker Barrel and, tells you how to like bake some apples or something. 17th century almanacs were very different. They were very popular. Sometimes said that they sold more copies of almanacs than they did the Bible. And they were also occult documents. They were part of tradition of kind of occultism that has existed next to sort of Christianity and Western culture. So it has to do with things like astrology and alchemy and geomancy and all that sort of thing. You can see that Daniel's almanac has little symbols that are sort of zodiacal. And historians like John Butler, for instance, have said that the popularity of almanacs had to do directly with their occult contents. And the Quakers did not like anything remotely to do with the occult. The names of the months and the names of the days of the week that they used were different than the ones that we use, because the calendar that we have makes sort of reference to, old Roman and Greek gods and Norse things like that. And the Quakers didn't like that. They especially didn't like Daniel's almanac. They especially didn't like it because he was picking fights with them at every opportunity. And he had this vehicle, this almanac, that sold lots and lots of copies, and he was able to include little notes in the beginning of it that said, the Quakers are really bad people. This is something called the Anatomy, which used to be in Leeds's almanac. And it was basically a way to, it showed you, the user of the almanac, how to prescribe medicine to yourself, herbs, based on where the moon and stars were. So it was kind of a form of astrology. I've heard the almanacs described as astrological toolkits. So that's not what I thought an almanac was. That's what Daniel's almanac was. The Quakers bought all the copies of one of Daniel's almanac and destroyed them. And they made him apologize for things. And they basically put a lot of pressure on him to change his almanac. So, yeah, I'm sorry. The Quakers didn't like his almanac. So Daniel retired in 1714. He died in 1720. I found a couple of different references that are sort of spooky, that are kind of devilish related. There's the Satan's Harbinger one. There's this judge of hell. Daniel was described as a judge of hell in one. Writing by a guy named Jacob Taylor, who was a Quaker almanac maker. He was also called Daniel Leeds' Devilish Liar by this guy Pastorius. So that seemed a little excessive to me, and I thought maybe this is kind of where the Leeds devil started. So flash forward to the 1730s, and Daniel Leeds has been dead for a few years, but he handed the almanacs down to his sons Titan and Felix. Now he'd been kind of pressured for a lot of his career to take kind of pagan or heathenish language, as the Quakers called it, out of his almanacs, and then he named his children Titan, who was the father of the Greek Roman gods, right? So I think he was definitely kind of rubbing it in a little bit. So let me read from the section of my book, if I can, or at least kind of paraphrase. But in 1732, Ben Franklin came along, and he was starting his own almanac, right, which became famous as Poor Richard's Almanac. And Franklin had a real sense of humor. He was very good at this kind of thing. The almanacs were competitive. Lots of people wanted in on the almanac business. And Franklin didn't have much of a name for himself, so he wanted to get some publicity. So he wrote in the preface to his almanac for the year 1733 that Titan Leeds, the son of Daniel Leeds, was scheduled to die of unspecified causes at exactly 3:29 on the afternoon of October 17th, 1733. And this news, while sad for Titan and his family, was not unwelcome in the Franklin household because Mrs. Franklin had been pressuring him to find a way to make more money. And a publisher had offered him some profits if he wrote an almanac. But he didn't want to do that because he didn't want to, he had too much respect for his, quote, good friend and fellow student, Mr. Titan Leeds, whose interest I was extremely unwilling to hurt. Happily, this obstacle would soon be removed. Inexorable death, these are Franklin's words, had prepared the mortal dart. The fatal sister had extended her destroying shears, and soon Titan Leeds, that ingenious man, would be taken from us. Franklin said that Titan Leeds was aware of this prediction, but he disagreed with it. Not on the idea that Titan was going to die soon, but on the exact timing of the departure. It was October 26th, not October 17th. This small difference between us we have disputed whenever we have met these 9 years past. So this was sort of a joke, that a trap that Franklin was kind of laying for Titan. And in response, Titan Leeds, rather than just ignoring this, he wrote in his own Leeds Almanac that poor Richard, this conceited scribbler, this precise predictor who predicts to a minute, has usurped the knowledge of the Almighty and manifested himself a fool and a liar. The hour of this supposed death, October 17th or 26th, had come, but Titan Leeds was still alive and ready to publish his almanac to expose the folly and ignorance of this presumptuous author, Poor Richards. So Titan was basically giving lots of free publicity to this new almanac, Poor Richard. He was also making him look kind of stupid because he didn't realize that he was being kind of made a fool of. So the next year, in the Poor Richard's Almanac, Richard said that due to the profits from his almanac sales, his wife was able to get a pot of her own and a pair of shoes. He, meaning Franklin, couldn't tell for certain whether Titan Leeds had actually died owing to a disorder in his family that had prevented him from receiving Leeds' last embrace. But he could say that the 1734 edition of the Leeds Almanac had not been written by Titan, due to the, quote, very gross and unhandsome manner in which he had been treated in his pages. Mr. Leeds was too well bred to use any man so indecently and so scurriously, Poor Richard wrote. Moreover, his esteem and affection for me was extraordinary. The real fear was that someone was using Leeds' name to sell almanacs, an unpardonable injury. In 1735, Franklin sort of continued this joke. And he said that even though he had resolved to put the controversy behind him, he kept getting messages. He was getting abuse from beyond the grade. Richard said that he received much abuse from the ghost of Titan Leeds, who pretends to be still living and to write almanacs in spite of me and my predictions. So Franklin was suggesting that Titan Leeds' ghost was producing almanacs and producing these letters against him. So that's kind of spooky, right? And one of the old names for the Jersey Devil, when it wasn't the Leeds Devil, was the Leeds Ghost, which is a phrase that that Franklin basically uses in this. So Ben Franklin was basically very successfully trolling, I think is the term that the cool kids use these days. He was basically trolling Titan. And he managed to embarrass the Leeds family, and managed to embarrass the Leeds Almanac, and to discredit the whole idea of what was called judicial astrology, which is the idea that almanac makers were sitting around predicting political events, which Franklin, being kind of an important Enlightenment, proto-Enlightenment kind of figure, that was part of his goal too. By 1738, Titan Leeds had died, and that was sort of the end of the Leeds Almanac. I think they kind of petered out a few years later. And Franklin went on to fame and fortune with Poor Richards. And this was actually a hoax that Jonathan Swift had carried out against an English astrologer named John Partridge in 1708. He'd done basically the same thing. So Franklin was kind of revisiting this. So that's the 1730s. The earliest anyone ever wrote down that we know of, the story that's become the Jersey Devil, was in the 1850s in an article in the Atlantic Monthly, which is a publication still around, very important. And a reporter had gone into the Pine Barrens from New York City. There's a theme here. People from New York or Philadelphia go into the Pine Barrens. They have an idea of what New Jersey is supposed to look like. Then they travel there and they discover this is not at all what I expected. And they write home to their editors like, we need to do a story about the Pine Barrens. And one of the original ones was this piece called Into the Pines. It was in the Atlantic Monthly. And in it, the author goes into the Pine Barrens and he meets some people who are sort of pineys. He calls them pine rats. And they start screaming at each other about Leeds' devil. You know, there's a storm kind of brewing. And one of them says, this storm is like the one when I see Leeds' devil. And the other one supposedly starts yelling, what's the good of naming him and always talking about him when you never know that he aren't beside ye? And they sort of shout at each other, and they're eating tomatoes. And there's other sort of New Jersey things like cranberries involved. So the author, whose name was Mayers, he asks his friend, who's sort of the local cranberry farmer, what is this thing, the Leeds devil? So the friend tells him the story. 1735 in Burlington, Mother Leeds, suspected of some amateur witchcraft. On a dark and stormy night, she gives birth to a son whose father could have been none other than the Prince of Darkness. With horse's head, bat wings, serpent's tail, classic sort of picture of the Jersey Devil, flies out the window into the village, devours little children, abuses the maidens, mauls the young men, and so forth, until a holy man comes and repeats the enchantment of prosperity, which I think is a Shakespeare reference. And Leeds' devil is kind of banished from the woods for 100 years. So that's the earliest that anybody knows version of the Jersey Devil story. And it's not all that different from the one that I remember kind of growing up. Why do I have this slide? Let's skip it. So the idea is that pineys, as they're presented in this Atlantic Monthly article, is a very negative image of the Pine Barrens and the people who live there and their folklore. The author of this Atlantic piece, which was about the Pine Barrens, said, you know, the Pine Barrens are not a good thing. Now we sort of recognize them as a valuable natural resource and a cultural resource. But this guy thought that, you know, they should have roads going through them, and they should be civilized. They should be plowed over and planted under. So the pineys that he describes are these kind of horrible backwood creatures. They're almost like a pest. It's almost like an agricultural pest that are preventing civilization from coming to this dark corner of New Jersey. And the Jersey Devil story is kind of symptomatic of the general superstition. Everybody in the Pine Barrens believed the Jersey Devil. And it would be a better thing if they didn't. I feel like that idea was sort of echoed. This is a guy named H.H. Goddard who ran a school in Vineland. Maybe some of you guys know about it. But it was a school where they studied pineys. And it was called a school for feeble-minded people. And the idea was that the Pine Barrens were full of people who had this hereditary taint, I think he called it. It went all the way back to the colonial era. And pineys, due to this kind of flaw that they inherited, were prone to poverty, were prone to having large children, large numbers of children, large numbers of large children, and they couldn't take care of themselves. And there was actually a movement to quarantine the Pine Barrens. That Goddard was basically a eugenicist. He's one of the sort of fathers of eugenics, the eugenics movement in the U.S. And the Nazis were very big into his book, The Kallikaks. This woman was supposed to be, her name was really not Deborah Kallikak, but she was an example of this family, the Kallikak family, that had a good half and a bad half. And the story of the Kallikaks, which is one of people living in the Pine Barrens unable to take care of themselves, is sort of the creation myth in a way, I think, of what we think of as pineys, or what we thought of as pineys. And it's very similar to the Jersey Devil story, I think. Mother Leeds had this large family. She was poor. She had too many kids. She couldn't take care of them. And due to her own kind of failings, she produced this 13th child, which is the Jersey Devil. And if you listen to enough people over the years, as I have described the Jersey Devil to you, and then you listen to it, the description of a piney, you realize that there's actually a fair bit of overlap between what people think of as the Jersey Devil and what people talk about as pineys. The ideas of the Pine Barrens and the pineys and their culture started to change not long after Goddard and his research were discredited, partly due to people like Herbert Halpert, who was a great folklorist who wandered around the Pine Barrens. This is him interviewing a piney. Halpert copied everything that people told him longhand, and it would drive the pineys nuts because they wanted to continue with their story, but he was busy writing. But he did amazing kind of work. Henry Charlton Beck started to kind of rehabilitate the idea of the Pine Barrens, right? They're treating it as a valuable sort of place. And then, of course, John McPhee in the 60s. McPhee's chapters on the folklore are based a lot on Halpert. By the time McPhee's coming along, he's kind of actually part of the movement to preserve the Pine Barrens. And there's explicit effort not to just preserve the woods, but also to preserve the culture of people who live there, of which the Jersey Devil is kind of part. Halpert, funnily, said that the Jersey Devil was not a big story in the Pine Barrens. There were other people. There were sort of like Salt Caesar, and there was a witch named Peggy Clevenger, and there was some other sort of characters. But for some reason, the Jersey Devil got more press coverage than these other more important folk stories. By the time I started doing this, Galloway Township, which is where Leeds Point is, up by Atlantic City, there was a effort there to adopt the Jersey Devil as the official town mascot. And they made up these little stickers, and they were going to put them on the sides of the police cars. So the town was proud of this connection, right? So we'd kind of come 180 degrees from this idea that this was superstition that needed to be. It was shameful. We have this guy, right? The hockey mascot is. I did not realize that the hockey team was named after our Jersey Devil, because the hockey team is, to me, that's Newark. That's like another country. I never. But then, and we're Flyers fans down here. What's that?
Yeah, they started Jersey.
Yeah, I did not know that.
They were a AAA team.
Oh yeah.
In
Oh yeah. I think the franchise came from Colorado. I go into this in the franchise came from Colorado, but there might have been an earlier. And then they had a vote. They said, what do you want our mascot to be? And I think it was like the Colonials and the Seagulls or something. And the Jersey Devil won out. And the owner of the team was like, they can't name it the Jersey Devil because that's Satanism. And he had to explain that, no, this is actually a folk story. And that's one of the stories, but I'm sure there's lots of variations on it too. So the Jersey Devil sort of jumping to pop culture. This is a very infamous picture of there was an X-Files episode made about the Jersey Devil. I think it came out in '93. And it's hilarious. It's very clearly filmed in Canada rather than New Jersey. But they go to Atlantic City, which I like because that's where I grew up, and I actually think Atlantic City does. A lot of the Leedses, Jeremiah Leeds was the first European settler on Absecon Island, which is now Atlantic City. But they drew this hilariously bad depiction of the Jersey Devil, which is widely mocked on the interwebs. By the late 90s, early 2000s, the Jersey Devil story is being kind of retold in television shows like Monster Quest, these kind of reality TV shows. Animal X was an early one that was kind of more X-Files inspired, I think. They sort of changed when TV kind of embraced the reality TV format. And this is a crew called the Jersey Devil Hunters. And they were local kids, and they would actually go out in the woods with their sound equipment and, what are those things called? Night vision goggles. And they were in a lot of these documentaries. And they had some bad experiences, they told me, where basically surprise, surprise, the producers of these films wanted a certain thing to happen, and they would kind of stage things and kind of manipulate them. But I think they had fun too. And they retired a few years ago. Lute is a super nice person. So the Jersey Devil, I think, is sort of this like C-list cryptid. It's kind of like sort of famous, but not as famous as. I thought this slide would be funnier. This is Carrot Top, right? David Hasselhoff, Scott Baio. He's not quite up there with like Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but he's, you know, people know about the Jersey Devil. In 1998, I think this was, a movie came out about the Jersey Devil, and it was produced by two guys from the Philadelphia area, I think, and the idea of the movie was a genre of horror movie called found footage. So this is where the movie that you're supposed to be watching is a video that somebody found somewhere. So it's about this camera crew. They go into the woods looking for the origins of this folk story, and they get eaten by the Jersey Devil. And somebody finds a video, and it gets presented in this. It's called The Last Broadcast. Has anyone ever seen The Last Broadcast? You've seen The Last Broadcast. I've seen it too, but not a lot of people have seen it. So they took this movie to the Sundance Film Festival in 1998, I think. And they had this whole marketing strategy to try to get a distributor to pick up their movie. And the whole idea was that the filmmaker, this really happened, right? The filmmakers, these guys were eaten in real life, and somebody found their video, and they put, you know, mug shots and pictures of these lost filmmakers all around Sundance. And they tried to get this coveted midnight showing, which is, I think, where the horror movies get picked up. And they just missed it. And next year, another movie had basically the same idea about some kids who go into the woods, they get eaten by a witch, and they advertised it the same way, and Sundance picked it up, and it played in the midnight showing, and that is the Blair Witch Project. And it went on to make $249 million just at the box office, and it spun off this whole series of follow-up movies and a remake, and I think one remake was supposed to be in Scotland. I think there's a Blair Witch 2. I think there's video game. Anyway, gigantic franchise. There are towns in Maryland that Blair Witch fans go and steal the sign like every week. So they can't have a sign anymore because some Blair Witch people will come take their. I'm exaggerating, but I do think there's a lot of energy around this story. But it could have been the Jersey Devil. Instead, it's the Blair Witch. I think maybe we're lucky that it didn't. The Blair Witch changed television a lot too, I think. And I think other people think too. It kind of kicked this whole like reality TV thing. And if you watch shows like Monster Quest or The Scariest Places on Earth or this kind of thing, they follow the sort of format. And the leads, the devil hunters, these kids, real kids, were doing their thing right around the same time that the Blair Witch movie came out. And they said that they were inspired, at least a little bit, by that movie. They had a website that they would collect sightings and stories and that kind of thing. This is Harry Leeds. Harry Leeds was in a lot of documentaries about the Jersey. Does anyone know Harry Leeds? People. If I gave this talk up in Atlantic County, people would. My grandmother hated Harry Leeds. Harry and my grandmother were big-time enemies. So Harry was in the press. This is my grandmother and my Aunt Dottie plotting violence against Harry Leeds. They had a grudge that went way back. I don't know if you can really see this. They went to school together, or at least they thought they went to school together. I'm kind of playing games with you, but they thought they went. My grandmother went to school with a Harry Leeds. This is my grandmother down here. This is my great Aunt Dottie. And this guy, if you can see him, the kid pulling the face in the school picture, right? He's got his finger. I think that's Harry Leeds. I was told that was Harry Leeds. He's right behind my grandmother. So I think he was very definitely a hellraiser, sort of a local. He owned a bar. There's lots of Harry Leeds stories. He was in the Marines and the Army. I think he got asked to join the military, as people used to. And he did videos when he was in the Army. He worked like with some film crews that were basically doing Allied propaganda that were doing Army kind of military propaganda, basically. But he was in a lot of Jersey Devil documentaries. This is the first one. When I met him in 1999, he had just done Animal X. And here he is listed as Harry Leeds, local resident. And he's kind of dressed like a piney. He's got his stubble. And very much a South Jersey fellow. He was also the mayor of Galloway Township. So he was one of the guys behind this effort for the township to adopt the Jersey Devil as the official mascot. And you can see here, this is him in Animal X. He's wearing a jacket that says Galloway, home of the Jersey Devil. This symbol on his jacket and the symbol that he had designed are the same one. The idea was that they would, make dozens of dollars by selling Jersey Devil jackets. This is Harry staring pensively into the woods on Animal X. This is Harry showing the film crew where this is supposed to be the ruins of the Jersey Devil house. He went to a couple different places. I think this was early in his career, before he'd been kicked off the property that he used to take people to. He's showing them where the Jersey Devil was actually born. Harry, when I met him, he showed me this video. We sat down in the Galloway Historical Society, and he said, I'm going to show you the video that I made. And in the video, he said, this is a very serious Discovery Channel documentary about monsters. Harry is credited with saying that a recent uptick in Jersey Devil sightings meant that, quote, the monster was, quote, trying to alert the people of something bad that's going to happen. He's very knowledgeable. He gets around. He knows what's going on. So I was sitting in the Historical Society with my grandmother, who wanted to strangle Harry Leeds, listening to him say that everyone in Atlantic County is afraid of the Jersey Devil, that there were so many sightings that we could detect statistically a little uptick, and that this uptick meant that the Jersey Devil was trying to tell us something. So I thought this was skeptical of this. And it never occurred to me that people sometimes went on to television shows and told things that weren't strictly the truth. And as I was watching Harry, kind of with my mouth, my jaw like in my lap, he winked at me as if to say, like, this is all kind of a put on. There's one other interesting thing about this claim that I didn't really pick up until later. Harry's saying that the Jersey Devil was predicting the future. It could tell that something is going to happen. And that's actually an old theme that goes back in Jersey Devil storytelling. The Jersey Devil was supposed to predict things like shipwrecks or wars and that kind of thing. And if you think back to the idea of a judicial almanac that's predicting the future, right? Maybe that part of the story actually has its origins going all the way back. So maybe Harry was not just pulling things out of the ether. He was actually kind of drawing on this tradition that was real tradition. So this is Harry, circa 2003. You can see this is another documentary that was, I think, a Fox, Scariest Places on Earth. These things kind of got given different names. But here he's described as Harry Leeds, descendant of Mother Leeds. And he's taking the Jersey Devil hunters out to Leeds Point to show them the birthplace of the Jersey Devil. They're going to film it. My grandmother went nuts whenever she saw Harry described as a descendant of Mother Leeds, because she thought she was a real descendant of Mother Leeds. And Harry, even though Harry grew up in the next town over, had the same last name, was from a different branch of the Leeds family. And those Leedses and our Leedses were not related. And Harry was pretending to be a real Leeds, or the only Leeds, as she put it. She was a really funny, sweet, lovely lady. But I guess we all have our, little hobby horses. And Harry in the media was one of my grandmother's kind of pet peeves. This is Harry's last TV show. This is something called Paranormal State, which is a very, I don't know how you guys feel about ghost hunter TV shows. I'm not a big fan. But this is Harry. You can see by this point he has shed his last name. He's just Harry Witness. I think it was getting a little bit awkward at this point. Like these camera crews would come down and they would do a Jersey Devil thing, and it was like, you interviewed the same guy that you guys interviewed last time. If everybody down here has seen the Jersey Devil, why can't you find somebody else? You got the same damn guy in every video. But these are very earnest, and they're not very earnest. They're actually hucksters. But they're interviewing Harry. This is out kind of by the end of Leeds Point. If you look, if I had a better picture, that's actually the skyline of Atlantic City. You can see it across the marshes. Harry was interviewed twice in the New York Times, periodical of note. The New York Times did stories about the Jersey Devil, and they found Harry, just like everybody else does, and he gave them really good quotes, actually. The Jersey Devil is a security blanket for South Jersey. I kind of think that's a good idea. That would drive my grandmother nuts. This is from Paranormal State. They sort of claim that they had taken some night vision footage of the Jersey Devil, but it's fictional. So Harry was in all these documentaries. That's Animal X. That's Fox. That's Animal X. Paranormal State. This is something he did for Weird New Jersey. I'm sorry you can't see it. He was basically a fixer. So I'm a reporter, and when reporters parachute into some exotic place like South Jersey, they need somebody who can translate the local language, who knows their way around, who can say, oh, the sunset is going to look really cool here, so you got to go to this spot on the marsh and set your cameras up. They're not, necessarily like filmmakers themselves or journalists themselves, but they know, the drill, and they can kind of help the people out, the producers out. And Harry basically played that role. I know because when I went to Galloway, I was funneled towards Harry Leeds through the same mechanism that everybody else was. It's unusual for a fixer to then appear in the finished product, but Harry did. He was in all these TV shows. I think it speaks to the credibility of this genre of entertainment. Harry told the Paranormal State people, this is what he's saying. In this shot, he's standing there saying, this is where I had my first encounter, right here with the Jersey Devil. I pulled my boat up, and out of nowhere there was this creature standing right about where you're standing. Hard to describe other than the piercing eyes looking at me. And then the guy asks, do you remember the color of the eyes? Oh, there was a reddish cast to them. And then he said, don't go out at night. Do not ever go alone because there's something out there. So I don't know how you feel about leaving the house at night as South Jersey people, but I'm usually not that worried about the Jersey Devil coming to eat me. But so when you see Harry saying these things to a national television audience, you wonder what he's up to. I think Harry was very much interested in making dozens of dollars selling his T-shirts and hats, but I also think he wanted to preserve the folk story, right? He was a real big booster of Galloway and South Jersey and this story, which his family and my grandma's family have had going for such a long time. So here he is as the mayor of Galloway, and that was his idea. He basically, they couldn't do this because basically violated somebody's copyright. There's a very famous drawing of the Jersey Devil by Ed Sheets, and the Sheets family is very protective. I'm sure you've seen this Jersey Devil. He's wearing a little kind of bow tie and a cummerbund. He's wearing he's wearing a suit. And it's a really adorable, iconic picture of the Jersey Devil. And this thing is too close to that. So the Sheets family said, stop trying to sell hats and jackets with our logo on it. Which is maybe for the best. So what I basically tried to do was answer, why did people tell the Jersey Devil story? Why do we like it? And there's a lot of reasons, obvious reasons. It's fun. It's a fun Halloween story. But one of the reasons that went through my crazy head is I didn't tell it very often when I lived in New Jersey. When I left New Jersey, when I went to college, when I worked in other places, I was asked, "Where are you from?" And I was, "I'm from New Jersey." And then I would imagine, look at the person I was saying that to and imagine the things that they're assuming about me when they hear that I'm from New Jersey. So, you're from New Jersey. Well, like, what do I know about you? So I was thinking basically of New Jersey stereotypes, right? Like, they think this stereotype was not, these guys weren't really in existence when I left New Jersey. But there is a Jersey stereotype. There's a Jersey joke that's been in circulation going all the way back. There's the Sopranos up north, Jersey Shore people. The one that I guess had anxiety around was this idea that New Jersey is suburbia, right? It's a suburban, cultureless, historyless sort of wasteland. This is in part because I grew up in a suburban housing development. But there's this idea that this sort of bland, homogenized, ticky-tacky houses. This is a real stereotype. It exists, right? I'm not making this up. Strip malls, that kind of thing. Superhighways. This is an idea that people have about New Jersey. That it's ahistorical. That history is something that happens elsewhere. That there's not much distinctive about this place. You could parachute into a suburb in Ohio or Florida or Colorado or New Jersey, and you wouldn't be able to tell, right? They have a cinnamon bun or a Cinnabon and a Starbucks and the mall. So I was worried about that. And when I went around interviewing people for this book, I felt like I saw people who had similar anxieties or similar concerns to me, and they were actively trying to kind of create a sense of history or a connection to history. This is a guy named Boo Pergament, who had something called the Boozeum. And he basically went around collecting old Atlantic City artifacts and putting them in his daughter's bedroom after she moved out. And he had this amazing collection of Atlantic City stuff. And now it's going to be, I think, basically being given to either Stockton or the Atlantic City Library. Historical reenactors like these guys, or even the devil hunters themselves, right? They're walking through the woods. They're walking through the woods in the suburbs. Leeds Point is kind of a suburb, I think. They're looking for the Jersey Devil, but they're also finding artifacts from the region's past. They're finding the ruins of like an old furnace or an old house or something like that. So I feel like that creating a sense of connection to history is a big part of why I like the Jersey Devil, maybe why we like the Jersey Devil story. You don't need to know anything about Daniel Leeds or the Keithian controversy or almanacs or whatever to know that the Jersey Devil story is old, that people have been telling it for a long time. So it creates a sense of connection. And in my case, talking about the Jersey Devil with my grandmother, which is something that we kind of bonded over, was a big way for me to feel a connection to the past. This is the idea, as I said, I think that suburbia, there's no there, right? As Gertrude Stein said about Oakland, right? It's sort of placeless. But there's a tradition, I think, of kind of pushing back against that. Publications like Weird New Jersey, they give you places to go, right? In New Jersey, this is a tradition called legend tripping, right? You get in your car and you drive out to look for the Jersey Devil's birthplace, right? Or you look for Lucy the Elephant, or you look for a road up in North Jersey where some crazy stuff happened. And it gives you a sense, these are secrets, right? These are secrets that we know down here as New Jersey people. Lucy the Elephant is weird. This guy's weird. The Jersey Devil was Jersey Devil owes a lot to Weird New Jersey. They do stories about him. I think this is connected to this kind of piney pride movement, as we said. Pineys used to be ridiculed by people from New York City or Philadelphia, journalists who came and found these people and were horrified. But the ideas around them have evolved over time, and now there's a very detectable piney pride movement. You can buy a Piney Power barbecue apron, or you could. So what's that all about? And the Jersey Devil is part of, I think that's part of what I was shooting for when I went off to college and I said, well, I'm from New Jersey, but I'm not from that New Jersey. I'm related to the Jersey Devil, right? I'm from this other New Jersey that is different from the thing you're imagining. So this is basically a long-winded way of saying the Jersey Devil is part of this authentic New Jersey, right? The one that we celebrate at the folk festival, and that kind of thing. I think the Jersey Devil belongs just as much in the suburbs, where I encountered it and where people talked about it, as it does in the Pine Barrens. So that's kind of a big part of mine. What I like about it, I went to like lots of Wawas and interviewed people in Wawa, because you don't get much more South Jersey than a Wawa. And they had lots of fun things to say about the Jersey Devil story. These are what hipsters used to look like, but I don't know if they look like this anymore. So I think, there's this idea that New Jersey is kind of divided into like the bad New Jersey that it's kind of cool to make fun of in pop culture, right? Like the Jerseylicious people or the Real Housewives or whatever. And there's this other authentic New Jersey, right? This is a really awesome picture of a guy with a piney power hat on. And saying I was related to the Jersey Devil was kind of the equivalent of wearing an ironic trucker hat like that guy's got on. And that's why I told the story. One of the reasons I told it. Also because I think it's a great way to learn about New Jersey history. Yeah, that's basically it. Thank you for your patience. I only had one minor panic attack. And it barely registered. Does anyone have any? Go, yes.
Harry Lee.
Harry.
How old was he?
Harry died in 2011, I think, and he was in his 70s.
Where was his bar at?
Well, he owned Muskett's Tavern, which was on Route 30, I believe, the White Horse Pike.
Oh, okay.
On the way out towards Egg Harbor. It was on.
Yeah.
It was famous for its blind bouncer night. That was the place that kids in high school would go to get served, because they didn't have very serious carding policies. There's lots of fun stories about Harry at Muskett's, and Harry's dad was actually the person that my grandmother was fighting with. So Harry's dad was also named Harry Leeds. My grandmother all these years thought that. But he would have been in his 70s in 2011, I think, when he died. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
One or two frames back, you had a picture on the right side. Yeah, that one. I remember seeing that in a restaurant near Smithville many years ago.
Oh, the Jersey Devil Lurks one?
Yeah, it was on the. I forget the name of the restaurant, but it's down near Smithville somewhere. And I remember seeing that. That was like 15, 20 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know where. Do you know where you got that picture?
I pulled this off the interweb. There's Oyster Creek down there.
Yeah, Oyster Creek.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I was there recently. I didn't see it. I actually walked around the restaurant trying to find that same one.
Somebody stole it.
Oh, it is still there?
Yeah, no, it's stolen.
Oh, it was stolen.
They've been looking for it. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's very
That's
great
the only
intelligence.
place I'd ever seen.
I don't
that
believe
picture
somebody stole
15,
that.
20 years ago at that restaurant, and didn't see it last year. When we were
Yeah,
there.
that's a really cool one. I think he's coming out of the mists. He's rising through the mists of a. I think that's supposed to be a cranberry bog, right?
I guess, yeah.
The Jersey Devil Lurks. It's a good one. Yeah. So my grandmother's family, they were not Pineys. They did not consider themselves Pineys. They called themselves Baymen, or the men called themselves Baymen, which is maybe splitting hairs, but to them it was a fairly big deal. So rather than do the piney cycle, which I think is like charcoal, blueberries, cranberries, they were basically fishermen. They went out into Great Bay and got oysters and clams. And, Harry's family also, they were baymen. So they were sort of living this like subsistence lifestyle, like a lot of people were, but it was more oriented towards towards Great Bay, the mouth of the Mullica River, which is where Oyster Creek is. The end of Leeds Point. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I was just wondering, my best friend in high school was Linda Leeds.
Oh, yeah.
she claims somebody else.
Uh-huh.
She's a relative of the Jersey.
Where does she live?
Pardon me?
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, her family is now in Port Republic.
Uh-huh.
She's not. I mean, is that someplace that you went to interview?
I didn't really go up to Port Republic. I mean, it's not far from Leeds Point, really. I did most of my research in like the Egg Harbor Township and Galloway.
I'm looking for a picture of her brother because he looks just like him. Exactly like him.
So one of the first mayor of Atlantic City was Chalkley Leeds, and his picture is up on the wall in the Atlantic City Hall. And when I look at it, I think that he looks a lot like my mom's uncles. The Leedses. But who knows how much of that is me kind of projecting things. Yes, ma'am.
I was telling the table when this would have been in the 50s, and my uncle took me someplace, and there was somebody dressed up in probably red long johns, and I know that we weren't the only people there, so this was advertised to come see the Jersey Devil, but I have no idea where,
Was a guy,
plain area or someplace.
somebody in red long johns.
Yeah.
Did they have wings and horns, or were they just?
All I can see is red. I probably didn't look because I truly believed that we were seeing the Jersey Devil.
Yeah.
And I was scared out of my mind. My uncle thought it was funny.
Yeah.
And just assumed that I would think it was funny. So I probably didn't really look at it very much. I probably walked around, looking at my feet. And I seemed to remember kind of going into a cave. Like that, so.
You shouldn't mess with children. People always think it's a good idea, and you hear their stories many years later.
Well, I didn't have nightmares after that.
Oh, good.
I just went, but it was commercial, so I don't know whether there would be advertisement someplace, something, because obviously people got there.
Yeah.
Unless my uncle just loved me so much that he had it done for me, and I don't think that was the case, because there were other people.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there like a northern and southern boundary to the Jersey Devil? Because I'm not native of Jersey, I'm from the Philadelphia area, but I spent a whole lot of time in Cape May, and I probably didn't even hear about the Jersey Devil until I was an adult. I mean, there was no Jersey Devil in Cape May.
It's interesting because like Cape May does fall outside a little bit. I just went to the history of West Jersey, right? When the colonies were split, West Jersey and what we think of as South Jersey overlap in a lot of ways that you think of. Like, really, it was this political boundary. But if you look at like who's a Philly sports fan versus a New York sports fan, or who gets their news from New York City versus Philadelphia, there's lots of different ways that South Jersey and West Jersey overlap. And I think Cape May was sort of cut off in some ways from the Quaker, right? This was settled by whalers and people from New England. Yeah. I mean, having grown up in Atlantic City, I think of Cape May as exotic. very far away, yeah. So maybe there weren't a lot of Quakers down here, or Leeds is down here, kind of telling this story. Yes, sir.
We grew up in Absecon.
Uh-huh.
And my grandfather would tell the story, but he would also include the sound that the Jersey Devil.
Do you want to demonstrate the sound?
I was actually trying to remember that it was like a bellow kind of sound, but anybody in your interviews, they have a certain sound? Or?
I think there's supposed to be a distinctive Jersey Devil kind of shriek. A lot of people have encounters with the Jersey Devil that don't necessarily involve seeing the Jersey Devil, right? You can just feel it kind of coming up behind you, and or you hear it in the distance.
You would go outside and maybe get that sound.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's like lots of theories about what that sound would actually be. Is it like, a fox makes a certain kind of sound, or like a great blue heron or something makes a certain kind of sound? I didn't really get into that. I mean, people. I was busy Interviewing people in Wawas, I guess. But I know that it's part of the tradition. Yeah. What's that? Okay. I don't get out of the house much, so I mean, I'm happy to sit here and answer questions about the deer that Emlen until the cows come home. Clearly spent way too much time thinking about this, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.